Hi, my name is Scott Lacey. I'm a fire protection engineer with a background in municipal and industrial firefighting, the code development process, a former AHJ, and a consulting engineer. In this video, for the Enhanced Rural Fire Water Regulations, we're going to take a closer look at Section 2, covering permits, plans, inspections, and commissioning, Section 3, municipal type water supplies, and Section 4, properties without a municipal supply. This training is intended as an overview of the content within the regulations. Specific content wording in this video is subject to change as we update the regulation. Please refer to the latest regulation for current criteria. Here's a snapshot of the table of contents. Again, covering sections 2, 3, and 4. We're just going to briefly touch on each of these. So in section 2, we cover permits. And this covers fire protection for subdivisions and commercial properties, or when otherwise determined by the AHJ, shall be prepared and sealed by a fire protection engineer registered in the state of the project. Now, this is not intended for individual single home water supplies, as long as the individuals submitting the criteria can adequately evaluate and apply the criteria for the AHJ. So this determination will be made by the AHJ if it's going to be necessary for individual properties, but typically it is not intended for the individual property owner to have to hire the engineer. Unless exempted by the AHJ, construction permits is required prior to the installation of cisterns or other water sources that are required to satisfy the requirements of this regulation. The AHJ is authorized to require a use permit to facilitate annual inspections and tracking of fire protection water sources. That would also be covered generally under the provisions of the International Fire Code. And see Appendix D of this regulation for general design checklists that may be used with the submittals. The AHJ is also able to develop their own checklists if they would need more specific information. Now, design submittals. All design concepts must be submitted and accepted by the fire authority. Complete submittals with drawings, calculations, product data, dimensions, elevation views, and etc. are to be submitted and accepted prior to the start of any work. Again, the level of detail for individual property in a single cistern may be different than a more complex subdivision that's incorporating multiple cistern tanks and elevations and terrain and slope. So depending on the specific project, the AHJ may require a little bit different level of detail. And this is also going to depend on just what the submitter is able to do without having to hire an engineer. Appendix D incorporates a number of different checklists. So this is just a snapshot, not really intended for you to be able to see and read, but it's just to let you know that we do have a number of checklists in the regulation. This particular one is for individual residents. And then there's also a section, that first part would be completed by the person submitting it, whether it be an engineer or a developer or the property owner. And then there's also a section incorporated on there for the reviewers, so indicating kind of the date when it was logged in, who received it, what the outcome is going to be, whether it's going to be accepted or not accepted. Inspections. All systems will require inspections during the installation and following the installation. One of the requirements we have in here is that the owner or the installer is responsible for obtaining pictures during the installation. These shall include, but not limited to, the following. So we want to capture these pictures of how the system is being installed, as we know the inspector cannot be up there the whole time, usually on all these inspections. So there's certain criteria and triggers where inspections will need to be performed before it's buried or covered. but we want to make sure that we capture pictures. It's too easy nowadays with cameras, our phones, to get these pictures and then have these as part of the record to show how the system was installed when there's questions or concerns later on. Commissioning is key. We need to make sure that the system was installed properly, but we also need to make sure that it functions properly. And the part of the commissioning needs to include the signage, the access, verify the thread types, the type of fittings, the connections, drainage, make sure pipe is sloped so it's not going to freeze. So there's a lot of critical factors. In some cases, we're going to have to actually flow the water. We need to draft to make sure we can get the proper flow drafting from it. We can turn around and pump that right back into the cistern through the inlet fill connections. We're just wanting to make sure that we do have water moving through the piping. If we have private hydrant systems, we need to flow and pressurize those systems. We need to flush them. And so it's going to take quite a bit of water initially getting the pipe filled, but also flushing to make sure we've gotten any trash and debris. If you've never flushed underground systems or even like standpipe systems in buildings, it's amazing the trash that can show up. Skull cans, any kind of tobacco, not picking on any product, Coke bottles and plastic bags from potato chips and lunch sacks and French fries, and there's no telling what will find its way into these pipes during the installation. So it's very important that all the systems be flushed to make sure that we get all that debris and trash out of there. The last thing we need is some of that debris getting sucked up to the inlet of the fire truck or into the pump. Now, section 3 is a key section, and that the objective of the regulation is that we do not want cisterns at every property. That's not our goal. Our goal is that we have an appropriate and readily available water source for every property, for every structure. So what section 3 is the first key point to say, hey, if we can get a municipal type water supply, that's what we want. If we're putting in a municipal type water supply to serve all the houses with domestic water, and the usage is such to be feasible to do fire water, that's what we want. And then that system needs to be put in per AWWA or other state or local regulations. Now, understand feasibility is a key term. So just because a municipal type system is available, the turnover in that water has to be high enough to protect the municipal system from bacteria growth. So let's say there's a water main that goes down the street and we could tap into that. However, we're only feeding 1 or 2 houses. A 4-inch or a 6-inch line running up to those 1 or 2 houses is likely going to have too much of a water volume in it for adequate turnover. So the municipal company may want to only run a 1-inch or maybe a 2-inch line. However, that's not going to serve for fire protection needs. Or we have a subdivision going in and each individual property is going to have its own well. Again, there's not enough water there for firefighting needs when each property's got its own well. So we have to establish the feasibility and the balance of this. So if the municipal water supply can provide enough turnover rate for domestic usage on a day-to-day basis, as well as provide the fire flow needs, then that would be deemed feasible. In the regulation in Appendix D with the forms is a form that will be filled out and submitted to the water utility company to evaluate this criteria. So what we have highlighted here, we'll just go through these to make sure we capture them all, is that individual properties, new subdivisions, or commercial properties that are within or immediately adjacent to a municipal water system shall satisfy the criteria of Section 3 unless otherwise accepted by the AHJ. This requires that if a municipal water supply is readily available, and it should be clarified as feasible, and can support the needs of the property, then it shall be utilized for fire protection water. The property owner, developer, shall submit necessary documentation and obtain the municipal fire water evaluation by the local water utility companies, unless otherwise provided by the jurisdiction or the water supplier. Use the municipal fee water evaluation form in Appendix D. So that means the jurisdiction or the water company may have a different form that they want to use with capture different information, and they're allowed to do that. Otherwise, we do provide a form in Appendix D that can be used. And then it shall be ensured that an adequate continuous water flow or turnover must be achieved within a potable water distribution system to ensure health and safe water is provided. So it's just important to understand that a lot of times firefighters and HJs are used to needing a lot of water in big pipes. We want high flow, but we don't deal with the day-to-day challenges of having that turnover and potably safe water. So it's important to understand that there's a balance there when working with the water utility company. Here's a sample of the form that would be found in the appendix. And a lot of times the water authority may provide attachments to this because it depends what's feasible. So maybe just as it is, it's not feasible, or maybe if the water flow can be increased, it could be feasible. So they may have different criteria on there when it's returned back from the water utility company. Now, Section 4 is what happens when we can't satisfy Section 3. So when we have properties without municipal water supply, Section 4 is going to kick in. And Section 4 lays out the general requirements for when a municipal type water supply is not feasible. The section includes the introductions or the triggers for Section 5, 6, and 7. Introduces partial split provisions that are found in Section 5, and that would be covered in the Section 5 video. There's a criteria of difference between a partial split of an individual splitting off their property versus a developer providing a subdivision. The HJ can require a water study to evaluate the ISO or the PPC impacts for their class of rating. And legal and liability requirements for sharing of water sources not owned or maintained by the protected property owners, relying on municipal water of which property owners are not paying customers. So the criteria is here is a jurisdiction may say, hey, we're not going to require these new houses in this area to put in a fire water supply. We'll go a mile or 2 miles down the road and just draw water from the hydrants that are down there. We've got tenders, we can get enough shuttles, we can do that. Here's the challenge with that. That water is a business. So that water is provided by a municipal company that has a board and possibly investors, and they're providing that water for their paid customers. So making a practice to start allowing other people to assume that that water is just there and it's going to be free and you don't have to pay for it is a bad assumption. And we're starting to see more and more, especially in areas where water is becoming more restricted, it's harder to get. That needs to be addressed, is who's going to provide that water, who's liable to maintain that water, make sure that hydrant is working. So that needs to be addressed in legal documents, that homeowner or developer or subdivision has permission of that utility company to use their water in a fire condition. Now, it's generally been accepted that, okay, we need water, we're going to go to a hydrant. We're generally not going to worry too much about that. That's kind of the old school. The new school is there is more concern about setting the precedence of saying, hey, no, you don't need to provide a water supply because we'll just go down the street and use somebody else's water. But it's just in the legal realm of things anymore. That's generally not recognized as good practice without having documentation and approval to rely on that water source. And again, who's going to maintain it? It's also an issue with insurance companies and risk-based protection. The insurance companies and the mortgage companies, they're actually buying the house, paying for the house, insuring the house, have concerns with the reliability and where that fire water is going to come from. So that's something to consider if you're even going to be able to get insurance without having a dedicated or documented reliable source of water. Hopefully this provides you a little bit of overview of these sections. Again, it's just an introduction to the sections 2, 3, and 4. Please watch for videos on other sections, and we encourage you to get into the regulation itself. Again, this is just an overview, and criteria is subject to change. So make sure you get into the current regulation that's being adopted or recognized by the jurisdiction for the specific criteria. Thanks.